you sort of telling us a little bit about you and who you are and how you came to be a PA.
Wow. Thank you. Well, first, let me thank everybody for the hospitality and allowing me to speak to everyone. I became a PA because of something in the U.S. called the draft lottery, which I don't think a whole bunch of people remember, especially in Canada. But you got to watch TV. It was during the Vietnam War, and you got to watch TV, and some old guy, who I am now very much like, I guess, got to stand in front of the TV and pick your birthday, and then they picked your draft lottery number. And you could be either number 1 to 365, and I was number 2, which meant I was going to get drafted sooner or later and go somewhere where I didn't want to go. So I decided not to do that. And I joined the Air Force Reserves, and we could speak for hours just about that whole thing. But at the end of the day, they told me I'd be a good medic. And I went for medic training, and I became a medic. And while I was in the reserve, active duty Air Force, that's 7 months, by the way. I did 7 months active duty. I met some people who were as good as physicians who were not physicians. And not knowing a lot about medicine, I was intrigued, and it basically scared the heck out of me because I was like, what is that about? And I got to be friends with them, and they were called PAs, and they were wonderful. And so I said, I want to be that when I grow up. I was 22 at the time, I think, or 21. And the next year, I was in PA school in Brooklyn, New York, at Long Island University, and I was from Brooklyn. I only applied to one program, and thank God they let me in, or else I'd probably be a lawyer or something, suing all the PAs.
No.
Yeah, really. And so that's really what happened. That's how I discovered the profession.
Right, and obviously not unlike the development of the PA profession in Canada, where it started as, a mostly military profession. These were medics,
right,
who had, just enormous skill set. Dave, that does sort of speak to this whole, how you've witnessed the growth and the development of the PA profession in the U.S., where it went from a military profession to a civilian profession. So that's sort of what I'm getting at. What could we learn in Canada about utilizing PAs in civilian life? It's taken us a little longer to get there, right?
For sure it has. And again, I'm not sure why, but that's a whole other discussion for another time. I thought about this question, and it's a hard one to answer because however I answer it, some people aren't going to like the answer, but I'm going to answer it just for me. Oh, by the way, let me say that I'm only speaking for me. I'm not speaking as a board member of any organization or an employee of any organization or an owner of any company. I'm just little old me. So yeah. I needed to put that on record.
Sure.
So I think, again, Canada has to do what's best for Canada. That being said, Canada should learn from the mistakes that the PAs here made. So I'm going to go over some of the things that if I had all the Canadian PAs in one room and I could speak to them, I would tell them were, in my mind, some things I would do differently. I don't want to say mistakes because I think you live through things and you learn as you live through things that you might have done them differently or better or maybe just faster or whatever. So number one, it's for me was PAs thought that the physician organizations were on their side. And I think it took us 20 years to learn that they were not on our side, and we generally are not a member of their family. They look at our education and still have not basically given us any credit for what we know. I mean, in any school or in any place, no physician organization has said, these guys are really great. These ladies are really great. They don't. they basically, in the States, say, at least organized medicine every so often comes out and says about us, oh, well, they don't know what they don't know, and they're good for some things, but they're going to wind up getting into trouble. And it took us, like I said, about 20 years of what I think was wasted political time to realize that we needed to advocate for ourselves, and no one was going to ever do it for us. If we showed up on Thanksgiving with a beautiful cake and we knocked on the door, they would probably say, who the heck are you? And we would say, well, we're your illegitimate kids or something that you don't want to recognize. And they would say, well, sorry, we're closing the door. And that would be it. And that's really, for the most part, how we've been treated. And so I would just pass that on and say, make all the alliances and make all the friends that you can, and clearly advocate for yourselves with anyone, including physicians, some of who've been wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I'm really talking about organized medicine.
Right. Not individual physicians who may be very supportive.
Oh, always have been. There have always been wonderful, beautiful people who supported PAs, who employed PAs, who advocated for PAs, but I'm not talking about those people. I mean, we can, now with social media, you can go on social media and I guess we'll find physicians or PAs or NPs that feel the whole spectrum of feelings about anything. Mm-hmm. But generally, physicians have loved us, and their organizations have not, and still fail to recognize many times our feelings and where we're coming from. So I would leave it at that. Number two, I would clearly point out that we still have a problem in the USA, and most, if not all PAs, I don't mean 100%, but I mean 90 or 85 will recognize and tell you, and it's that of our title. And you guys being part of the British, and I know you're not part of Britain, and I know some Canadian history, being part Canadian in a way. I used to hang out in my summers anyway in Canada. So, but being part of that system, or closer to the British healthcare system than the American healthcare system, might want to look at using physician associate for now. But clearly, our title in the U.S. does not represent who we are, what we do, the level of education we have. It's really misleading. It's confusing, and I almost think it's been a yoke that we bore, that we succeeded in spite of. Had we had another title, it would have been a lot easier. So that's really without going into too many war stories, that would be my second.
Just to be clear for those listening, and this is something that you've written and talked about at great length. You think the title should be physician associate, not physician assistant. No,
I think if I were in Canada, I would do that now, because all of the British healthcare system has done that.
Yeah.
No, I don't anymore. So let me tell you where, maybe Canada wants to think about the way I'm thinking, so let me tell you where I'm sitting now. Okay. I was behind associate for many years, and we'll get into this later, but we're really changing our paradigm here in the States, and the way we think, because we have to. And we'll get into the have-tos later too. But physician associate to me is like, all my life, I didn't have a name, and I've been married to Bonnie for many years, and so you just called me Bonnie's husband. And it was the apostrophe S, Bonnie's husband, and that's who I was. And then you said, you know what, that's not really fair anymore, so we're going to call you Bonnie's partner, or maybe even Bonnie's associate. Well, that's still not me. Mm. And I think we need to be me, whatever me means to us. And I'm not sure what that is yet, honestly.
So you don't have a name, you haven't figured out the title you want?
No, I have not. But I would go to associate for default, but it's not the title. I would say it's not the title we probably will wind up with in the States. And I'm not sure where we're going with it.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I would speak to not using assistant, because if Canada's anything like the U.S., and I'm sure it is on this level, assistant is a technical level person who does not have the ability to diagnose, treat, prescribe, and do all the things that PAs do all over the world. And it's confusing. So I would limit that. I would also, my number 3 would be to use our studies and don't start out 25 years behind us, where the studies are going to be coming out fast and furiously. I'm going to do a plug for my site, Come On Clinician One. We are always posting new studies about PAs and nurse practitioners. I wouldn't want to duplicate what we've already done. I don't think the human body is any different in Canada than it is in the U.S. And our studies, if they're done well, and most of them are, and we're going to have many more NP and PA studies, and many more of us working together. By the way, they will show that we're excellent, as they've been showing, and you can use those. You can walk into the legislators and other people in the provinces and say, listen, here's great studies. And if I were looking at them, they're really irrefutable. So why not do that?
Right. But let me just ask you, though, on that point, Dave, what I hear from government officials a lot is the studies they want to see is that we can save the system money. And because our two healthcare systems are different in the way that, we're a single payer system, supposedly universal healthcare, and yours is
right.
Insurance driven. Can we really use your studies to show that we could save the Canadian system money?
Well, I think you can use our studies to show that the care you give and the quality of it is as good as any other practitioner's care and quality. Mm-hmm. And that's a big one for me. And then it's, again, how you fit yourselves into the system. It certainly costs less to educate PAs than it does physicians, number one. Number two, I'm sure that PAs in the Canadian healthcare system don't make as much salary as physicians do. And number three, and in fact, I'll be posting it probably tomorrow, but there was a letter that was in JAMA Internal Medicine about a study that they're starting to look at PAs and nurse practitioners in specialty medicine and saying, wow, they do the same level of work that people who went to residencies in specialties are doing, basically. I mean, we may not be doing the surgery, but in many of the cases we are, and not doing the surgery, but we are doing the same level of work. And for what we're doing the same thing. And so they, again, even in the States, they haven't been looking at specialties as much as they were trying to look at primary care. Yeah. And so specialists, it has to be that we cost less, both in education and again, in once you know your stuff and going out there and providing care, I would have to believe. So. Okay.
Did you have any more?
Yeah, I did. And again, I think I touched base with this a little bit, but it was work with other healthcare groups earlier than we did. So make alliances with the pharmacists. And I know the NPs have been a little harder than they have been in some of the states here, but with the NPs and the physical therapists and whomever, not just with the physicians, not saying because the physicians are bad or anything, it's because I think we need to spread our chips around the table a little bit. Keep them all in one place doesn't serve us as much as making friends and alliances wherever we can.
It's tough because even the other groups you mentioned, aside from just the nurse practitioners, when in Ontario we applied to become a regulated health profession, those other groups also stood up to say, we'd prefer you didn't regulate them. Almost it's still the turf protection runs pretty deep, even among professions where we don't pretend to be able to provide any services. And I guess it's just because it's all brand new and people feel their jobs are threatened with cutbacks. I don't know.
Right.
Tough.
I would agree.
Yeah. So let's talk about the way PAs are paid in the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit about how PAs bill for the work that they do?
Well, obviously, there's a number of ways. Insurance companies pay PAs, and you would have to be credentialed by that company, and they would pay us sometimes the rate that a physician gets, and sometimes 80%. I'm not an expert in payment, by the way. And then, obviously, if you're working for a private group, they would pay you a salary, and you would either elect to bill, they would bill for you, whatever. I'm saying they would bill, and you could bill under your name, or if the physician sticks their head in, and so it's not fraud, under the physician's name. What we found in Medicare is that we've been able to bill for many years. I think it's like 25 years. And our federal system for the elderly and Medicaid, which is the state system.
Right. And
if the physician sticks their head in, you get billed at 100%, or we can bill at 100%. And if they don't, we can bill at 85%, 80%, 85%, I think it is. So what happens is either someone will stick their head in, or the biller will just say they stuck their head in because the biller wasn't there. And it's done two things. Many times the PA doesn't even know that that's happening. And then number two, which is even more important, even with the insurance companies, the service was provided by the PA, and it keeps us invisible. So we have become very much so, even with 120,000 of us now in the U.S., a visible but also an invisible profession, because so many of our patient encounters, if you want to call it that, are billed under the physician's name, so they can get, and the hospital can get, or the clinic can get more money. And so we know that's a problem, and that's called Incident 2, by the way. That's the expression. So you'll see it talked about more and more in the future, and we are now saying we would like to do away with that. And so are the NPs, by the way. And we will have an argument about how much, at what level we should build. Should it be 85% or 90% or 95% or 100%, or should you just pay for the service that's rendered, or however that works out? But in the end, it's going to be we don't want to be invisible anymore. So we'll get to the optimal team practice, but one of the pillars of optimal team practice, OTP, as we're calling it in the States, is that the PA always bills under their own name. Because I really think, Maureen, that 50 or 60 or some number, and I'm not speaking for the AAPA, I don't know the exact number, but it's huge number of people we see are totally invisible, and our system, our entire system, thinks physicians are seeing them. And again, if you get into specialty care, home care, other care, God only knows what some of the agencies are thinking, or the insurance companies. So we have to take a real look at that, and the way you start is to bill on your own. So we have to start doing that.
If I understand it, you're advocating for this billing on your own, not because PAs would then earn more money, but more because it would make PAs more legitimate, more visible to the public and the patients that they serve. Is that your point?
Yes, it's exactly the point. Undoubtedly, I think PAs would make more money. Undoubtedly, when you know your worth, when any of us know our worth, whoever they are, you're more powerful in the way you negotiate. But I think that would be a byproduct. I think the reason we would want to bill in our own name would be so we become visible instead of being invisible in our system.
And, I appreciate you talking about how it works with Medicare and Medicaid because, those are more similar to our healthcare system in Canada. On the other hand, I know that in Canada, our governments are wanting to move away from a fee-for-service model of physician payment. So they're unlikely to ever give PAs a billing code and the ability to bill on our own. I can't see that ever happening here. They want everybody on salaries eventually. What do you think?
But they'll still, being on salary wouldn't prohibit. I hear you, and I even understand, what you're saying. There's value-based care now, but at the end of the day, people want to still know who's doing what, who's responsible for what, and how productive each person is, and then each class of, provider would be. And so there has to be a way, even in Canada, where people care about that. And I think that's what I'm advocating for.
Yeah, interesting. So,
right.
I've certainly been following you over the years and your advocacy for the evolving role of the PA. And I want you to talk a little bit more about how that role in the U.S. it has changed even just over the last, 5-10 years.
Sure, thank you. I guess, first of all, it's changed very quickly. Well, as you know, we in many states have to be supervised. And what people don't know is that supervision is a word that PAs define very differently than everyone else defines it. And so in New York, if I read you our PA legislation, and New York's the largest PA state in the country, we don't have to tell the state who our supervising physician is. We don't have to be physically near them in any way. We can run a clinic and basically bill and do whatever we need to do, pronounce people dead, and do all this stuff, and the physician can be 20, 30, 50, 70, 90 miles away. And again, the state doesn't even know, there's no paper, there's no form, and the PA is basically fully practicing legally and fine. And I'm not saying everybody should go out and do that tomorrow, but that's the law. And so supervision has always been very broad and very lenient, if that's the right word, because you didn't want to always strictly define it because it would hamper PAs going to the places where they needed us. Mm-hmm. Well, over the last 2 years ago, in the AAPA House of Delegates, the House of Delegates passed a resolution, a very brave one, that said PAs will no longer be supervised. Now, for those Canadian PAs that don't understand our House of Delegates is a PA branch of the AAPA, and we just come up with resolutions which could best be interpreted as the statements on something from our profession. Mm-hmm. So they have no legal weight, they have no reality. You'd still have to go back to your state and change the law, but at the end of the day, they're what our profession feels on record. Okay. So we went 2 years ago, we said, okay, we're going to collaborate, which is the word that nurse practitioners use in the 28 states or whatever, 27 states now, where they need to collaborate. They do have a couple of states, actually, where they use supervision also. But it's a less confusing, much nicer, sweeter word for probably doing very much the same thing. And in the last 2 years, I think a number of states, 3, 4, have passed collaborative practice. So PAs clearly collaborate here in the States now, and the VA has full collaborative practice. Michigan, 6, 7, 8 months ago, changed everything and said that PAs need a participating physician, which meant that they only needed a practice agreement. And that's not an only. I mean, I'm just saying they needed a practice agreement. But it was very interesting as it was interpreted, and I agree, as broader than just collaboration. And so it was another step towards full practice.
And sorry, what does that mean, a practice agreement? Just that a physician agrees that once in a while they're there for you to call if you do need some help, but
right. I think I actually am not sure, but I think it's an agreement. And what it is with the NPs, it's an agreement that spells out who you go to and the chain of command if you need help, basically.
Right.
And what you can do or can't do, depending on where you're working and whatever. I don't mean you can do a physical exam or not, but more like, I'm not sure, but I know that it's where you go for. It's the physician and you have an agreement that he or she will participate with you and you will be a PA and provide care.
Right.
And it was just it certainly was looser than supervision. And I'd have to go back and look at it, but it was a step in the right direction for us.
Okay.
And this year, a number of organizations backed a resolution to say that actually a task force was formed to look into what the nurse practitioners and we would call in full practice authority or responsibility. And that meant PAs would not need supervision at all. And really, I'll tell you what it meant after the House of Delegates, because that's more important. But it meant we would have laws not unlike the NPs for many reasons, and we'll get to the reasons after. So there's clearly been variation, number one, and I think both PAs and NPs have been looked at as medical providers now, where 10 years ago we were looked at more as adjunct providers. Mm-hmm. There's PAs doing absolutely amazing things. There's PAs doing things surgically. There's PAs doing everything. Anything you can almost imagine we're doing now. And we're holding our own. We're good. So that's still evolving. So where we got to back in the House of Delegates was actually before the House of Delegates, the AAPA put together a task force. It was chaired by a wonderful PA named Jeff Katz, who's the past president of the AAPA, and they looked at full practice authority responsibility, that we were calling it full practice responsibility, and that was for a reason. So let me go into this a little bit, because I hope that people who listen find it interesting. More and more physicians in the States are now becoming employees of large hospital systems, and these large hospital systems are buying up private practices and small groups. So years ago, where 3 or 4 physicians would be together, the local hospitals coming in, or the larger hospital systems coming in and saying, we're going to give you excellent money, sell us your group. And they're selling the group and they're becoming employees. And this has gone on now for a number of years, and it will go on way into the future, where very few physicians will open up private practices. And yes, there's a thing called concierge medicine. We're not going into that, where people just give you a lot of money and you're like, right, we're not going into that. So what we found was that the more the physicians became employees, the less economic incentive was there for them to employ a PA if the PA and the NP both were doing the same thing. They seemed to prefer, and many members were telling us, they seemed to prefer the NP, regardless of what we thought about how our education was, or that we went to school in a different way, or we were the medical model, or whatever you might think. They wanted to employ the NP because the NP was legislatively, legally, less of a hassle. And in 23 states, NPs in the U.S. have full practice. They don't need any supervision. So they don't need co-signatures, and they don't need meetings, and they don't need this or that. So these physicians, once there was no economic variable, said, listen, we don't need this anymore. So did the hospital or the institution, where they said, we don't want to hire 5 physicians just to be, quote unquote, collaborating physicians when we can just hire NPs who don't need them. Now, yes, of course, NPs need them, but they don't need them legally. They don't need them by law. PAs did. So they were like, well, we don't need PAs anymore. We don't want to hassle. We don't want the responsibility for another profession. And that's what we were hearing more and more from regular PAs just out across America, really. So the task force got together, and they came out with a report, and the House of Delegates looked at their recommendations, and it was really about, I guess, taking responsibility for what we do. That was really the hallmark of the report. And I had written previously to that for years that to be a real profession, one has to be responsible for what you do. In America, I hope you call them the same thing, but we have licensed practical nurses. They're under RNs, and they can go to Costco and give flu shots and whatever, and get paid, $200 for the day, whatever they get paid, and they sign their name and they give shots and they go home, or they do whatever, and they can make a nursing diagnosis and whatever they do. And here in the States, physical therapists have what we would call full practice in every state now. And people can walk into their offices, or at least I think they do in most states. I think it's every state now. And people can walk in without a referral from a physician, and they can diagnose and treat them, sign their name, they go home. Audiologists sign their name, they go home. And we were sitting there, and because of legislative problems, really, hearing from the PAs in America that the system wasn't working for them anymore. So the House of Delegates got together and they passed optimum team practice. And we wanted to keep team in there because we feel we're members of a team, not like NPs aren't. They are also. We just thought we wanted to stress that. And so let me tell you about the 4 pillars of OTP, as we call it. One was full PA responsibility. No supervision, not saying you don't work as part of a team. And I'll go into that a little bit later because that's the 4th pillar. But we would be responsible for what we do just like any other professional in the world, period. Right. Number 2 was reimbursement to the PA directly. Now, if you're working in a large group, you do what all the other providers there do. You sign your waiver and they bill in your name, and the group gets the proceeds. But at least you would know what you were bringing in. You would know what you were worth. You would know your value, and we wouldn't be invisible anymore, which was the biggest thing to us, to stop that invisibility. Because again, if you're looking at all the other healthcare providers, they're now becoming visible, and the PA's staying invisible, and that wasn't working. So that was number 2. Number 3 was we asked for PA boards of medicine to be either split out, or at least the boards that have authority over PAs, even if it's from the Board of Medicine, the MD Board of Medicine, to allow the majority of people who sit on it to be PAs. Because we felt that we needed to regulate our own profession, our own practice. And that would go along with being responsible. If you're responsible for what you do, you clearly should be responsible for your own profession. And then lastly, we said we want to collaborate. Collaboration is good amongst all healthcare providers, and clearly within what we do and our paradigm, we want it, but we want it determined at the practice level. So you go get a job, and they look at what you've done before, and you're on the interview, and they look at all the things that you bring to your interview, and They speak and function is determined not legislatively, because it's really not, no other profession needs supervision after 30 years in practice.
Mhm.
So we want that collaborative relationship determined at the practice level. So if you're in a satellite clinic and you need it once a month, fine, you'll get it once, and if you need it every day, you'll have it every day. That's not the point. It should be determined on your education, your experience, how good you are, and not because legislation says it, that 20 years later you still need it. So
that answered one of my questions, because some of the people listening to this podcast will be brand new grads who will be frightened at the thought of being left on their own to just start practicing with no supervision. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying that would be determined when you apply for the job, and the people hiring you would determine, your level of supervision in accordance with your education and experience.
Right. And it might be other PAs that determine that.
Yeah.
It's not. It's shifting the paradigm to recognize that we are a real profession, and so we take again. Keep going back to this. We take responsibility for what we do. So if you're a brand new student, you go out, and if you can, you're going to diagnose otitis media, and you're going to listen to people's lungs, and you're going to do physicals, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and you're going to obviously treat hypertension, but you might not treat a really complicated case of diabetes.
Right.
Right.
No Still's disease.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you're gonna take that, and that you will determine, because you are a professional.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this. So let me draw a parallel. In the same way, a brand new RN doesn't run in ICU
Right.
the first day, or a brand new pharmacist isn't mixing ingredients in IVs that the second it goes in your arm, it could potentially kill you if it's mixed wrong. You gain experience, and you gain, your education and your training, and you get to do what you are able to do, but that's determined always for all those professions. It's determined, even physicians, what you do is determined at the level of practice, at the practice level.
So just let me moving it along here. You've been talking about the goals of this wing of the AAPA. What's the reality? Are in most states right now?
I'm not sure about the question. The reality is that PAs are
do they need supervision, or can they practice collaboratively, independently, all those nice things in the language that you use?
No, the reality is that it just passed 2 months ago, this optimal team practice.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Michigan needs that, what did I say it was? I wrote it down, but right, it's not participating physicians, right? There's a number of states that need collaborating physicians, and all those, again, every state's legislation is different. In real practice, PAs generally see patients as any other medical care provider does. Diagnose, treat, prescribe. We can prescribe in all 50 states. We can write all controlled drugs, class 2 to 5 in 49. No, I'm not sure about that. We can write controlled drugs in 49 states now, and one state we cannot. And that would be what we would call class drugs. I'm not sure how you say that in Canada, but the addictive drugs and
right.
Benzodiazepines and whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we function as, I don't want to compare us to anyone else, as PAs. We function as medical care providers who are professionals by education and clinical training who can provide medical care. And so the supervision is generally, again, determined at the practice level. And really what I'm saying the House of Delegates did is almost say what's really going on in reality. Right. Again, I told you New York state law. And New York state law, I physically never have to meet the physician. Not saying that that happens, but you can be in a rural clinic for a month. Mm-hmm. And maybe you talk, maybe you don't. Maybe you have as much experience as many of the physicians you work with. If you're just out of school, you're not taking that job. So that's the best way to describe what goes on day to day. There are PAs in and out of the military that are chief of the family practice clinic. There are PAs that are doing great things in every specialty. I don't even want to say one or the other, and that's in a collaborative way, but clearly not using using their education and experience. That's the best way I'm going to put it.
To work at the top of their scope of practice.
Exactly, top of their license.
Another trend. Sorry, Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Another trend that I've been watching, and these things always start in the U.S., but then they come to Canada, is this what I like to call degree creep in the medical professions. So that now I think that entry to practice for physiotherapists is now a master's degree. And of course, NPs are getting doctorates. So now it's doctor, nurse, so-and-so. And I think that's, in the States, you have a couple of PhD programs for PAs as well. What role do you think that will play in PA education in the future?
I think it's there now. It's an elective. So let me go back. I grew up, I'm one of the PAs that grew up really, really, really believing that you don't need to be a doctor to provide high quality healthcare. So my life was dedicated, seriously dedicated to showing the world that that was possible. And here's what happened along the way. I got converted. Well, I'm not saying you need a doctorate at all to provide good health care. I'm saying in the future, we will probably have them. So let me tell you why. In the States, every physical therapist now who goes to school goes to a doctorate in physical therapy program. Occupational therapists, the same thing. Audiologists, same thing. Psychologists, same thing. Naturopaths, same thing. Chiropractors, same thing. Dentists, same thing. Now, we can all argue PA training by hours is 3 months less in the master's program by hours than traditional U.S. Canadian physician education. So it's not really that much less in hours. I think where we are limited in our education is in residencies and structured postgraduate education. Not saying that you can't learn it after you graduate, because we have 110,000 people here who've shown you can.
Yeah.
And you can. But looking into the future, I really believe that we will have to, along the way, many of us will get doctorates. And so let me go into that a little bit, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the public, if we're going to do what physicians do, and we're going to look towards having optimal team practice and those 4 pillars, I think the public and I as a patient would expect that level of education, number one. There are, number 2, for me, and I just jotted them down the way I thought of them, these are not in any order, is other professions, and I don't want to go into this one, with a much lesser scope of practice than what PAs can do in the States for sure, are graduating with doctorates. And if we're going to write orders and write other things, expecting other professions to listen, or whatever that word would be, I don't even like the word order, because it's a word from last century. But if we're going to write suggestions and other people need to listen to our suggestions, more and more, it's going to be expected that we're on the level they're on. I also think that reimbursement, again, in the States is a big issue. And I think all those other professions went to the doctorate because they found that reimbursement at a master's degree level in the States was a problem and will be a problem in the future more and more again. And I agree that there's degree creep, but I want to throw out a couple of things. Well, again, I also threw out my number 4. We spend probably more graduate school hours than any other profession in PA studies than MDs or DOs. So why would we not want to reward ourselves for what we've earned? Just clearly an interesting question. And I think it's just part of the evolution. I agree with the degree creep in a way, but I also think there's a part of me that says sometimes we need more critical thinking skills around other parts, administration, leadership, and even clinical skills that wouldn't hurt us to have add-on doctorates where it's just in a more structured environment. And as you know, we have, I'm not sure of the numbers, so don't quote me, but I think it's like 140, it might be more, postgraduate PA residencies now across the states. And maybe it will be that if you do those residencies, which will add on even many, many, many more graduate hours, if you're working 80 or 100 hours a week or whatever, clearly you will come to realize that there's no reason that you don't deserve a clinical doctorate. So for me, I think we have to look towards the future and not look towards the past. And so
I hear all that, and I think you are being a realist. This may not be the way we would choose to go, but it's the way things are going anyway. But, that's going to be a hard sell to young people trying to decide, do I go to medical school or do I go to PA school? If you're going to make the PA program longer, more expensive, I think a lot of them choose the PA route because they want to get it over with and get out there and look after patients.
I totally agree with you. And if you noticed, there was a word that I didn't use and you didn't use, and it was mandatory doctorate.
Right.
I think these are going to be add-on. I think you're going to go back to school. There's one at Lynchburg. You guys come Lynchburg College in Virginia. One of my good friends is a program director. There is one at A.T. Stills in Arizona. One of my good friends is program director. And they're add-on, they're clinical. I think in both, there's a number. I think there's 5 now that are announced in the States. And they're, except for one, they're add-on. And you can do leadership, administration, or education, or something like, they're clinical, but you can also take other courses and you will be given hours and projects in either leadership, administration, or education. So they are they're going to get us in the boardroom and in other places where we need to compete, again, in these big healthcare systems where we're not going to get in many cases without it.
Okay, so now I want to throw something at you that wasn't in the question line, but I have to ask you. Because Canadian PAs feel that our options are somewhat limited compared to your options in the U.S. And now you've got us even more excited because you're talking about these, residency programs and the idea of doing a doctorate. Do you ever see a world in which Canadian or even European trained PAs will be allowed to practice in the U.S.? Right now, we can't.
I don't know. It's a fascinating question, and thanks for asking it, because one of the things that I'd like to go back to do is find out what good reasons are, especially for Canadian PAs. And you know what? Not even. If you're following the same model of education and you're as good and you can pass our boards, I'm not saying anything again. I'm not representing anyone but me. But I don't see a problem with that. I would love it that the legislation in Canada got so good that we PAs in the States would be clamoring to do the opposite. And right. I think that'll happen. I don't know if your listeners know, but PAs in the Netherlands, of which they have a number of PAs, I don't know how many they have, but they have thousands, are independent practitioners. There are experiments all over Africa with PA-like people, and many of them are. So it's if we all look at, again, I think it goes back to what I said in the beginning, the best practices of PA education, clinical training, where we're going. I don't want to be, and this is one thing I'd like the listeners just to sleep on. I don't want to be a 90% physician. I want to make it where I say I'm 100% PA, and everybody understands that, and that's cool. So getting back to your question now, yes, I think that will happen. I'm not sure how we get there. Obviously, that's tied up with the NCCPA. It's tied up with PA programs. Just saying, yes, we would be okay to allow whatever mechanisms we have to allow for that to happen. Not sure, but
that might be a good topic for an interview with the the licensing regulatory board in the U.S. sometime. Find out why we can't write that exam yet, right?
No, I would be all for it. There are the British PA programs. I think echo both of our countries' PA programs. I think there are a number of countries that are just doing excellent work, and there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to go to London for a year and get to sample what they do there. Although I can now as an American PA because they're not licensed either, and it's still a weird pilot thing.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I why not?
Good.
Right.
All right, let's wrap up by talking about social media. You and I are gray, but we're both pretty active in social media. Why do you think PAs should be involved in social media?
Well, for those PAs that don't know, how I got into I'm a medical communications expert, and how I got into it, not how I got into it, but I was in journals, and I was with two of my partners, the publisher of the #1 journal read in America for both the PA and the NP profession for about 10 straight years. And so when I looked at what to do for my future, after we sold our company and I was left at the doorstep crying, saying, oh my God, what am I going to do now? I took a couple of years off, did some consulting work, and realized that the future was not as much on paper anymore as it was on my computer, as it was through the internet, as it was through social media. And so I put my money where my mouth was, and I started a site which Canadian PAs can join also, although I'm not sure how we get around having what we call an NPI number. That's a provider number in the States, but we will. But in any case, Clinician One is a site, and I started it and put up money, and I had a partner that put up money, and I think social media is the future. Obviously. Why do I think it's the future? You can't beat the speed that you can both learn new things, new developments. You can't beat consulting with 5 or 6 other friends on the same day at the same time. You can't beat taking classes, looking at pictures of rashes when you're not sure of which rash that they get from visiting Africa. Right. And then, things like even professional news and healthcare news, but professional news. If you're not on social media, I'm not saying everybody has to have a big mouth like I do and get on and and tell you what they ate every morning, because really I don't even want to do that.
No.
Right. But if you're not on, you're missing a lot. And as the years go on, and it gets that much more both acceptable and professional in our nature, we're going to be missing a large part of our postgraduate education by not being on social media. And I think we need to share information, and we're not doing it by writing a letter to each other anymore.
No.
Right. We're doing it by sharing on places like this and other Skype and Facebook and Clinician One, and the AAPA has the huddle for AAPA members, and there are excellent conversations that go on there now. I mean, really good on all of these sites, and I've learned so much. I mean, just from my colleagues that I would have never met, and we've actually put together. There's a group. It's a sort of a progressive PA group called PAs for Tomorrow. Some people would say a little bit more than progressive, but I started it with a number of other PAs, and all of us only met on the internet. We had many of us had never physically met each other.
Wow. And
we met each other amazingly at our first board meeting.
Yeah. It's really utilizing the power of this the internet and the distance between us, but bringing everybody together, as you say, instantly. And I have students I teach at McMaster on this issue, and they're all amazed that I have over 1,600 followers on Twitter. Their image of Twitter is, like you said, what I had for breakfast this morning or what I'm doing with my friends this weekend. But I tell them, no, it's where I get my medical health information, professional information, right? It's a community out there.
Right.
And it's replacing newspapers in many ways for me, right? So it's great.
And newspapers are never going to let you know that Alberta passed legislation allowing PAs to exist or do X or do Y or have full practice. They're never going to let you know that.
Right.
That'll come around 7 days after, because somebody got angry about something. And if you're online and you're clued into the right places, you'll know that before it happened.
Yep.
You really will. You'll know probably the way the vote's going to go before the vote's taken. Yeah. Right.
Well, I would encourage the listeners to check out Clinician One. I've been following it for many years, and it is a pleasure to talk to you like this with this extended period of time that we've been given. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Dave.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a dream come true to speak to my colleagues from Canada, I have to tell you.
Perfect. Thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you.